Hey everyone, this is John Dickinson from Motionworks here for Boris Effects. In this tutorial we're going to be taking a look at some of the terrific features in Boris Continuum Complete 8's Particle Emitter 3D. And as you can see, we've got the Motionworks logo here and it's being formed out of particles. And this is all happening in 3D inside of After Effects. Now this completed animation also features Boris Continuum Complete 8's Particle Array 3D, and that's giving us these great clouds. It also has Boris Continuum Complete 8's Lens Flare 3D for the lens flare. We won't be focusing on those particular effects, we'll look at those in different tutorials. But today we're going to focus on Particle Emitter 3D, and I'm going to show you step by step how to build this animation where the logo is formed out of these word particles. Okay, so first thing we have to do is to create a new composition. I'm going to name this Main, and I'm going to be working at PAL D1DV widescreen square pixels. This is a frame rate of 25, and I'm going to choose a duration of 6 seconds. You can choose whatever preset you want in here. Just drag this up into my comps folder. Now I'll create a new solid. I'm going to name this Particle Emitter 3D. Make sure this is comp size and click OK. And to apply the effect, I'll go to the Effect menu and choose BCC8 Particles. Particle Emitter 3D. And if I drag my time indicator, you can see there's my basic particles. Now this is a very big effect and it's been conveniently broken up into sections. If I just twirl down Emitter, you can see how many settings just Emitter has. So I recommend when you're working with it, just go to the section that you want to focus on and twirl that down. When you're finished, twirl it back up. You can see Particles also has a massive amount of settings. So let's start off with Emitter. And what I want to do first of all is I want to crank up the birth rate. Give me a load more particles. And I'm going to drop the particle speed to 0. Now my default emitter shape is point. I'm going to change that to sphere. And you can see we actually do have a sphere shape. If we come down to rotate Y, you can see that this is indeed a 3D shape. Let's choose box. So fully 3D particles. What I want to choose though for this is layer map. And we need to place a layer map into the composition. I'm going to use the Motionworks logo. Now I've already created a composition for the Motionworks logo. This is Emitter Shape Source. Let's just open that up. And there's the logo inside that comp. So I'm going to place that into the main composition. I'm just going to disable its visibility. We don't need to see it in order to use it. And I've already chosen Layer Map from Emitter Shape. So now from Emitter Layer, I'm going to choose Emitter Shape Source. And now you can see the particles look roughly like the logo. I'm going to just increase Scale Master to about 170 and crank up the birth rate to about 750. Let's just reset this rotation back to 0. Okay, so now you can start to see the logo pretty clearly. Maybe just a little bit big. Just going to drop that scale back just to make sure it fits within the frame. Okay, so now we want to have the particles flying in from left to right to form the logo. For that we animate the position XY. So I'm going to put my time indicator at about, let's just work in frames here, at about 40 frames. And if you're wondering how I changed the display style of the current time here, I just command clicked on it or control click for Windows. Okay, so let's set a keyframe for position XY. And we'll come back to 0 seconds. And we'll just slide that back out of the comp. So there's my 2 keyframes. And the particles are flying in from left to right as they form the logo. just going to scale the logo down a little bit more as well. And we can do that in the emitter shape source comp. And that's the reason for pre-composing this logo. Makes it much easier to work with the logo when it's in its own composition. Okay, looking good. Now you might notice that some of the particles aren't forming the logo. They're just continuing to move to the right. And that's because of this setting here, inertia from emitter. If I set that to 0, watch what happens. All the particles will move into the frame and all of them will form the logo. But this is kind of a cool look because particles flying in, some of them form the logo and others just continue to move to the right. And that looks a lot more organic. Okay, so let's just twirl up emitter now and twirl down particles. Here under image collection, you can choose different kinds of particles. There's a nice big long list of particles that are shipped with Boris Continuum Complete 8. You can also create your own particles as .tiff files and save them in this list. I'm going to choose Sparkle 4-pointed flaring, and I'm going to increase the size to 50. Take the size random up to 90. Let's choose a color other than white. This color here. And finally, change the blend mode to add. Okay, so they're starting to look a little more random now. Now to make this left to right animation look a lot more organic, a lot more dynamic, we use fractal field. So let's twirl up particles. We'll come back to that later. Twirl down fractal field. And the first thing we're going to do is animate the movement noise. So around about 3 seconds, that's 75 frames. I'm going to create a keyframe for movement noise and have that at 0. Then come back to 0 seconds. And I'm going to crank this right up to 2000. Much nicer. Much more organic. I'm also going to animate the noise frequency. So I set a keyframe for noise frequency. Come back to 0 seconds. And we'll just knock that back to about 35. Very nice. Starting to take shape. Still some work to do. What I'll probably do is just ease these keyframes and choose Keyframe Assistant, Easy Ease In. And we'll just knock back the auto evolve speed. Just make them a little less manic. That's 75. Looking good. But what I'd like to do is have the particles really spray around a little bit more before they form the logo. And we can do that by animating the rotation on the Z. So I'm going to come back to emitter, twirl up fractal field, and come back to 0 seconds. Set a keyframe for rotate Z. And we'll come to about 15 frames, and we'll set that to -30. And come a few frames later, and we'll set that to 15. And we'll come a few frames later again, and we'll set that back to 0. Just going to even the timing of those out. So what's going to happen now is the emitter is going to rotate on Z, and it's going to spray particles one way, then it's going to spray them back the other way, making it look even more organic. Maybe just make these happen a little bit earlier. Probably about over 15 frames, I would say. That's better. Now we're getting some particles a little bit further out from the main group of particles. Okay, so next let's come back to particles. And we want to make these particles fade in when they're born and fade out when they die. And we can do that using the opacity evolve graph. Now, to get access to the opacity evolve graph, you can see it's grayed out here, we have to check use opacity evolution. If I twirl that down, we have a nice big graph here, and I can click the choose button to choose one that is close to what I want. Maybe that one there looks pretty good. But of course you can also draw your own graph, and you can use soften just to smooth that out. But I might just come back to my choose button again and just come back to this one here, which looked pretty good. And now the particles are fading in. They're holding their opacity and then they're fading out. And this is giving us a more sort of subtle, natural look at the start and at the end of the animation. Okay, so now we have the basic animation in place. We've still got a fair bit of tweaking to do. But next we want to replace these particles with text particles. So first of all, I'm going to add the text comps to this main comp. This is particle image source 1 and 2. It's going to hide their visibility. And these are just some text comps, Particle Emitter and BCC8AE. And it's best to pre-compose custom particles because often you'll want to apply color effects or some kind of effect to the layer, but it needs to be pre-comped in order to see those adjustments in the main comp. So now that we have those in the composition, we can come up to Particle Shape, Image Collection, and we can choose Host Image Layers. And the first thing you'll see is a bunch of squares. What we have to do to get the layers to be visible, just twirl up Opacity Evolve Graph, is come down to Image Layer and choose Particle Image Source 1, and also Image Layer 2, and choose Particle Image Source 2. And you don't have to use 2 image sources, you could use 1. But if you use 2, of course, it'll add a little more randomness, a little more detail. You can see how the color has actually become quite saturated. That's because Mix In Particle Color is active by default. I'm just going to deselect that. Now we have the original color. Alright, now we're getting somewhere. Now, we have some other options under particle shape. We're going to choose Cards 3D because if we use Cards 3D, then the layers can rotate in 3D space. And we have a couple of other 3D options. There's Spheres 3D, which I thought looked kind of interesting. That's wrapping the text around spheres. Kind of an interesting look. And Cubes 3D looks quite good, although the text is a little bit small for that. There's also Cylinders 3D, which also looks pretty good. Look like rings. More of a graphic look. For now, we're going to choose Cards 3D. And now the cards can rotate in 3D space. So let's make some adjustments to this. I'm going to twirl up Particles and twirl down Transform Particle. Randomize Orientation is set to 180 by default. Let's just knock that back to 0. And you can see now all the text is oriented the same way. It's all upright, which in itself is a pretty good look. We want to add some randomization. I'm going to make this about, say, 18. I'm going to turn bidirectional tumble on. To give this some tumble, I'm going to increase tumble to about 95. We also want to randomize that a little bit. We'll give it some auto tumble speed, about 60. And some randomization. So let's just change tumble random to 50. Okay, so now the particles are tumbling in as they form the logo. You can see there's a lot of control over rotation and tumble and spin. It allows you to get just the look you want. Now the particles are probably a little bit too big. I'm going to come back to particles. And we'll just knock the size back to about 22. And we're probably going to have to animate the particle size in a moment. But first of all, let's add a camera. Layer menu, new, camera. It's going to choose the default settings. It's going to select the effect layer again and choose use comp camera. Select the camera layer, press the P key. And it's going to zoom right in. So we start up nice and close. Maybe minus 250. Looks good. Set a keyframe for that. And as the logo forms, zoom out. Maybe not quite that far. Maybe to minus 1700. And we'll just drag that keyframe back to the start and ease the end keyframe. Right click, keyframe assistant, that's outside the capture area, but it's right down the bottom, and choose easy ease in. That'll ease the camera at the end of its move. I'm going to check how many particles we have. Now we've only got 750 as a birth rate. I'm going to double that. Let's also animate the particle size. At the moment the size is 22. Just going to set a keyframe for that. And I'm going to have it pretty big at the beginning. Make that 125. Now our particles are probably actually a little bit too far to the left now. It's going to bring them back. That's better. Maybe it's a little bit more. Okay. Particles are sweeping into the frame as the camera's pulling back and the logo forms. Let's add a grid to the floor, give a better indication of how the camera is moving. I'm going to press Command Y to make a new solid, name that grid. From the Generate menu, choose Grid. Now that width and height is a little bit too big. It's going to make that just comp size and make this layer 3D and probably just sample the color from the particles. Alright, press the R key and I'll change the X orientation to 270. That'll make this a floor. Just shift that down. Just to adjust the border size. And now actually I will make the solid a little bit bigger. Okay. Just shift that back. Okay, so now you can see that as the camera pulls back, we are indeed moving in 3D space. Okay, so let's add a light now. It's going to be a spotlight. That'll just help us make this a little more interesting if we light the floor. So I'm going to choose 4 views bottom. Gives me a better idea of where my light is in the scene. And just going to click and drag the light up above the floor. Maybe just lift the light up a little bit too. Okay, looking good. So what's next? Well, next we want to create the part of the animation where the particles blast forward. And we'll do that by setting a keyframe for particle speed at 4 seconds. You'll find particle speed under emitter. Particle speed. So the first keyframe is 0. And we want to animate the particles to be pretty fast. We'll change that to about 1200. At the moment the direction is random. Let's just change that to forward. See, now the particles are starting to shoot out towards us. We can probably drop the spread down. Let's make that 0. They're a little bit too dispersed. And they should shoot out straight towards the camera. Very nice. And finally, we need to animate the keyframe birth rate so that particles are no longer being born. Also, I probably need to move this grid down to the bottom. Let's just take that, shift it to the bottom. Okay, so our birth rate is 1500. I'm going to go 1 frame later and make that 0. You can probably have that happen a little earlier. So the particles shoot out, no longer being born. Actually, we'll do that even earlier. About there. So the particles are shooting out. They stop being born. And they should start to fade away at the end of their lives. Very nice. Let's just check out what we've got. Now you may have noticed when we're up close to the particles that the aliasing is a little rough. You actually have some options for adjusting the anti-aliasing under render. By default it's set to none. Low is usually a pretty good place to start. Makes it fairly smooth. But you can go all the way up to highest. But of course, you know, the higher you go, the slower the system will become. See, now we've got a pretty smooth result. And we're not suffering too much in speed. Let's just fine tune this a little bit more. I'm going to come down to external forces. And I'm going to increase circular movement to about 5. And you can see how this gives the particles a kind of a bubbling look, which looks really organic. Probably drop the frequency to about 0.5. That's going to slow them down. We've also got this option here, fade in circular movement. And this happens over seconds. At the moment we've got a particle lifespan of 2 seconds. I'm going to change that to 3 seconds and change the fade in circular movement to about, let's see, 2 seconds and 12 frames. And what that does is it has the circular movement fade in towards the end of the particle's life. So as the particles approach the end of their life, they start moving in a circular fashion. Okay, so here's the basic look. The particles fly in from the left in a really nice organic swirling fashion. They form the shape of the logo and then they blast towards the camera. Let's go ahead and take a look at the final version again. Now obviously this is a very deep effect. There's a lot of parameters, and I had a lot more time to work on this finished version than I have with the version I've just shown you, and I've done a lot more tweaking. You can see here that when the flare blasts out, the particles themselves actually start to glow. They scale up and glow. Now that's because the particle size has been animated, so as the BCC lens flare becomes bright, the particles themselves, or the size of the particles, is animated. So we get this sort of blown out white. And then it's animated down again as the particles disappear. You might also notice that as the particles fly out towards the camera, they've got a really nice tumble. That makes them look a little bit more natural, a little bit more random. And obviously you can see we have these clouds in the scene. This is BCC Particle Array 3D. I'm going to turn on this static camera. And let's have a look. Grab the camera tool. If I just move my camera around the scene, you can see that these are true 3D particles. And it's amazing how much the BCC Particle Array clouds add depth to the scene. Okay, so let's just take a look at a couple of other examples. I've got this one here, flaming title. And here once again we've used a comp as a layer source. And you can see the particles giving us some pretty realistic flames. Also have this one here, title smoke out. And that's very convincing. Where the title itself just bursts into smoke or bursts into clouds. You can see as I drag through here, looks very good. Always a good look. Title WIPO 1. We can wipe the title off with particles or on with particles. Okay, so hopefully that's given you just some idea of the power of Boris Continuum Complete 8's Particle Emitter 3D. For now, this is John Dickinson from Motionworks for Boris Effects. Have fun, be creative, and I'll see you again soon.